I remember having these conversations with my editor about how closely factual reality was now starting to resemble a conspiracy theory.
There's a class of people out there who own lots of the things in your life. You'll probably never know their names. You might not even be able to find out their names. They might own the house that you rent. They might own the care home where your parents spend their final days. They might own the nursery that you drop your kids off. They might even own the YouTube channels that you subscribe to. Not this one, though. This group is called private equity. And the name is itself a kind of camouflage. Doesn't really tell you anything about what these people do, which in many cases is simply to buy a company, load it up with debt, and then walk away with the money as the thing collapses. Some private equity groups are involved in the water companies in the UK that are pumping sewage into our rivers. And the whole thing is essentially secret, unless someone happens to tell you that they've been bought by a private equity firm. It's not often easy to tell. The justification for all this is that this is just capitalism being capitalism, doing what it does best. It's creative destruction. It's the healthy churn of the market. It is the culling of the weakest of the herd. And that's the strange thing about private equity. Although its proponents like to present themselves as superior managers of capitalism, they are at the same time possibly undermining some of its basic conditions. Hettie O'Brien is the author of The Asset Class, How Private Equity Turned Capitalism Against Itself. And it's that contradiction that I want to get to in this conversation, because it's currently structuring much of our world, from the Gulf state sovereign wealth funds to the private hospitals, where people are chained to their beds unless they can pay their debts, to the degradations of the great British high street. This conversation connects to my other episodes with Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff on the Elon Musk empire and the strange anti-gravity of the private markets, and to that one with Luke Kemp about how societies fall apart, often hollowed out from the inside. And if you want to explore those connections in detail, the map is freely available on the Novara Media website. Link in the show notes. Hettie O'Brien, welcome to Do Your Own Research.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about what private equity is. There's one particular kind of mechanism that defines or that dominates private equity as a business model. That mechanism is the leveraged buyout. What's a leveraged buyout?
So a leveraged buyout is something that involves a colossal amount of debt. When a private equity firm or fund buys something, it will effectively take that thing, or historically has taken that thing, whether it be a company or an asset, private. So it means delisting its shares from the stock market. And so normally when you buy something, you need to get enough shares to gain control of it, which would involve an awful lot of money. Unlike a kind of typical takeover, a private equity fund will borrow maybe 80% of that money and then use the remaining 20% as its equity stake. So it will inject the money of its investors. The thing that makes it different, and this is where I think the kind of scandalous part of private equity really comes into play, and this is always the thing that people can't really get their heads around when I explain it to them, is that if you or I were to borrow money, we would expect to pay that money off eventually. But a private equity fund pushes the money it has borrowed to buy a company down onto the company itself through something called a debt pushdown. So in effect, the company goes into debt in order to pay for itself. And the benefits of that debt, they effectively juice the returns of the private equity fund. So they make fund managers very rich, but they don't actually necessarily have a particularly beneficial effect on the company that those debts have been loaded onto. And so when you think about what that means across the entire economy, rather than just at the level of individual firms, you can see how that buildup of leverage can actually lead to a kind of weakening of companies, because companies that are massively indebted have less cash flow to spend on the other things that they arguably should be doing, investing in productive activities, providing good services to their customers, paying good wages, this type of thing, because more and more of their cash flow is being spent on paying down debt. So that's what a leveraged buyout is. And I think the other part of private equity, to understand what it is, you've really got to understand the private part. I think that's really significant. You've mentioned, obviously, publicly listed corporations, or at least the stock market. And that historically has, although far from perfect as a form of accountability, it has kind of ensued particular forms, or there have been particular forms of accountability that have gone along with that. So when you are a publicly listed firm, you have to provide a certain amount of information about what you're doing, about your accounts, about certain risks that your business faces. And all of that information trickles down eventually to the public realm, to society. And that's designed to help both investors and the public at large figure out what's going on within the economy, and ideally sort of hold to account large corporations and corporate power. And so when all of that information disappears from view, it means that that process of holding to account power becomes much more tricky.
I want to go through the kind of history of how we ended up with such a large and strange private wing of capital that can't be accounted for, that doesn't have to tell you anything about itself, that operates in this extremely baffling way, where, as you say, I mean, that's just like such a surreal sentence. I feel like it's quite difficult to understand. A company goes into debt to buy itself and transfer ownership to someone else. Like, it just feels so unbelievably strange. I think you were saying that people can't quite wrap their heads around. No, because it's complex, right? Because it's like so patently outrageous as a tool. I kind of wonder, like, why is it legal? Like, what is the history of lobbying and power that has allowed for us to have this tool where you can force a company that was previously public to become private using debts that you then put onto that company itself?
I mean, it's legal because it's effectively, and this is something that applies to the industry at large, it's looking for loopholes, and it's a kind of form of legal arbitrage where you are looking for those loopholes to exploit, or at least kind of rules and regulations that you can take advantage of. In the case of the leveraged buyout, it all has to do with limited liability, which is obviously something that has its own very controversial history, and something that we tend to think of as being a natural and defining feature of capitalism, because if investors were liable for the debts that they accrued in the name of a particular company, surely that would mean that nobody would ever take risks, nobody would ever invest. Capitalism, the wheels would fall off and the whole system would fall apart. And actually, we forget when making those types of assumptions that limited liability has a really recent history. I remember reading that George Bernard Shaw, the writer, when he first heard about it, said that when a company has limited liability at the end of it, it means that a group of gentlemen are advertising the fact that they don't intend to pay off their debts. And so that's where this is coming from. I mean, there is also a real history of lobbying around this industry, as with so many parts of the financial sector. I think the things that make this particularly unique, in Britain at least, have to do with the way in which that lobbying has shifted over time depending on the needs of the British state, or at least what the political class believed to be the needs of the British state. So in the early 80s, you had the British Venture Capital Association that was founded. Then the private equity industry was in its kind of nascent form. And the BVCA lobbied on behalf of the industry and made the argument that this would basically welcoming fund managers into Britain would help to inject entrepreneurialism and vigour into the kind of British economy that many politicians, particularly people like Keith Joseph, felt was in a kind of sclerotic state and needed to rediscover its industrial, ironically, because this has nothing really to do with industry, but industrial kind of spirit. And then, in the present era, the BVCA has since changed its name. I'll look up what it is. I think it's now called British UK Private Capital, Invested in a Better Future. And you can see that there's a tonal shift there in the type of narrative that it's purporting to be, that it's presenting. And that narrative has now become much more about filling in the gaps where the state isn't willing to spend, because we live in a climate where fiscal rules have sort of bound the current Labour government into a tight spot, and mean that there is this kind of wariness over public borrowing, public finances, and the idea therefore being that private capital will step in to provide the solutions. So that's what it looks like in Britain, that lobbying.
So there is this idea that private equity will rejuvenate British capitalism, which in the 1970s is widely regarded as having fallen into some sort of doldrums, some sort of sleepy social democratic malaise. Let's fast forward to the present day. We're walking down a British high street. What do we see? What have the effects of private equity actually been?
Well, I mean, the effects of private equity are really all around us. And I think one of the first things that really struck me was just how deeply entrenched it was in the most intimate realms of our lives, whether that was housing or the water system or care homes. I think when it comes to the British high street, actually this industry has been very adept at sort of spotting undervalued companies, companies that have been undervalued or have had a real struggle accessing capital, which kind of speaks to, I think, a quite a difficult climate within the UK, because if you wanted the kind of long history, it would have to do with the way in which British pension funds sort of ceased investing in UK equities. And that meant that many UK companies struggled to access capital. And that meant that they became sort of undervalued and then became sort of ripe for takeover targets. And so that's what you see with a company like Morrison's, or, some of the other kind of high street brands, whether that's Claire's or WH Smith, now TG Jones. And there's a sense in which...
Awful rebrand.
It's one of my favourites, yeah.
What does it mean?
I know. I think it's a sort of, it's like a sort of ChatGPT version of like a British high street store. And the thing is, they've done nothing about the really bad carpets that are in at least the one near me, which is like one of the kind of jokes about WH Smith was it always had these really just awful, grubby carpets. But that's by the by. I think, and that there's an aspect of sort of within the British high street specifically, it's in a really tricky place for a number of reasons. And so what get called private equity funds often look more like distressed real estate investors come in and find ways to make money when all of the kind of opportunities for profit seem to have sort of vanished. But I think the thing that was really troubling to me when I was doing the research for this was less about the British high street and more about particularly sectors like care and nurseries and children's care and so on, where really this industry feels like it's a colossally ill-suited match for those types of industries that are dealing with really vulnerable people. And so, some of the research on care homes in particular is just really grim. And the sort of effect of a leveraged buyout on a care home can be pretty catastrophic in the sense of mortality rates can go up. And all of that debt that we spoke about previously has a really tangible effect on the ability of a care home to actually provide for its residents, or can do. So that's where it gets quite dark.
It's 11%, right? So companies I think that's the stat you quote in the book. The care homes that have been taken into private equity versus care homes that haven't been taken into private equity, the ones that have been bought out by a private equity firm have an 11% higher death rate.
Yeah, that's
right?
That's one study in the US that found that it studied, I can't remember how many care homes it looked at, but I think it was something like between 100 and 200 before a private equity buyout, a leverage buyout, and after. Death rates went up afterwards by, I think, 11% on average. So yeah, pretty steep. Similar thing applied in Britain, where during the first wave of the pandemic, care homes that had much more leverage, the mortality rate was far higher in those than it was in care homes with no leverage at all. So that's the kind of human cost of all of that debt.
People are literally dying because there is too much debt on the company, which prevents them from doing the things they need to do, like buy presumably the masks, the gloves, the clean things that are essential for caring for someone who might die from COVID.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the model has to do with capturing a company's cash flow in order to service a debt that you have pushed upon the company to enrich yourself and ostensibly your investors. And it's a sort of way of capturing, the future potential of that company, as well as its ability, obviously, to provide the things that, in the case of a care home, keep people alive.
I want to come back to that kind of conspiratorial aspect of it, because I think there is this sense that, if you're looking at capitalism rationally, you say, well, obviously it has lots of aspects they don't like. Obviously it's subject in the Marxist frame to fundamental contradictions of class and so on. It runs out of steam eventually in the kind of the long-term Marxist model. But we can acknowledge that, okay, yes, there is a productivity increase. It just seems like private equity companies are doing something quite naked, quite like parasitic, quite kind of just straightforwardly destructive to these institutions. Is that a fair characterization? Is there something very zero-sum about what is happening here, rather than tendency towards growth and so on, which in the long run benefits everyone? Or is there something? I mean, like how do you see that sort of? Because it sounds, what you're describing just sounds quite evil.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things going on there, and I think one of them is that when I was looking into this, I was really keen to speak to people who you would think of as being the kind of arch defenders of capitalism. Because I think it would have been really boring to write a book that was only about something that is so scandalous and only speak to people who already disagreed with it, because you sort of know where they were coming from, and it's very easy to find private equity critics. But it was really notable to me that when I spoke to people who considered themselves to be rational capitalists, so many of those also really had such a problem with this. And I think it's because it sort of turns the idea of what capitalism is supposed to be about totally on its head. Capitalism is supposed to be about risk-taking. And actually, this doesn't really look like taking risks. It looks like pushing risks somewhere else where you never really have to be held accountable for them or feel the effects of those risks. And capitalism looks like value creation. Well, when you look at the historic performance of private equity as an asset class, it's had a really hard time actually delivering on the promise it has made to its investors. But also over a longer time period, it's arguable that it hasn't really outperformed public markets. So that kind of value creation point is also questionable. But then I think, what is, I suppose it depends on your definition of what capitalism is. And I think that to some extent, I mean, you make the conspiracy theory point, and I think so much of, at least in the sense that the definition of capitalism that you or I might share, and the reason that private equity doesn't really fall within that, is because we're sort of living within this long 20th century idea of what capitalism ought to look like. And it's a similar thing going on, I think, with conspiracy theories. Our idea of sort of modernity is so tied up with the notion that the world is effectively rational, that facts matter, and this idea that there is a sort of potentially a malicious will, or a kind of, people meeting in private rooms and deciding the fate of things that we all rely upon without us being around to scrutinize that, really feels as though it flies in the face of how we have been encouraged to navigate the world for so many years. And I think that's it. It sort of, I guess it challenges, I suppose, so many of the things that we associate with modernity more broadly, in the sense that we don't think that, the world should operate in this way. We don't think that private networks and that kind of inscrutable actors that should play such a central role in our lives. We think that the world is effectively a rational place. And I think that this sort of really defies that. And I think that's really, to me, I found that challenging to kind of make sense of, because I really wanted to approach this. And I did approach it, entirely in good faith, desiring to speak to people who both agreed with and disagreed with the model itself. And yet, the unifying thing was that nobody really thought that this was capitalism, at least in the sense of what capitalism was supposed to be about.
There is a crucial problem here with sort of understanding private equity, I always find, which is just the very simple problem that Blackstone, which is one of the largest private equity companies in the world, if not the largest, has almost identical name to BlackRock, which is a totally different kind of company. There's an asset management company. And I remember listening to the Odd Lots podcast. Everyone should listen to Odd Lots podcast very recently. And they had someone from BlackRock on. And at one point, one of the hosts accidentally refers to it as Blackstone, because they have very similar names and they're massive companies. And the BlackRock person is deeply, deeply offended that he would be associated with private equity. Even for people who are serious asset managers, he was just disgusted at the idea of being associated with this thing that I think, yeah, as you're saying, seems like a sort of a perversion or a failure of what capitalism is sort of supposed to be. Let's go into some of those ideas, though, because obviously, as you said before, there is this idea that capitalism has to be rejuvenated. It has to be brought back from its sclerotic and complacent mere sort of middle managers, its pencil pushers, its bureaucrats. And the use of debt is a kind of disciplining tool there. When did this set of ideas start? When did we get into a problem with having to discipline capital from sort of the outside or from private equity?
I mean, I think that to me at least, you can tell the story differently in different places. And I think if you want to tell that story, in a way, it's important to tell it both from a UK and a British perspective, because they are quite different contexts. In the US...
A US and a British perspective.
Yeah. And I think, this is a kind of, in a sense, it's a US phenomenon, and yet it has a kind of Anglo-American character to it because it really took off in Britain in the time period in the 80s and since then. In the US, I think that this has a lot to do with even going back as far as 1929, the Wall Street crash. And after that, you have this attempt on the part of the Roosevelt government to really bring capitalism into the light and basically regulate the hell out of bankers and and the financial markets, because those have become sites of dangerous forms of speculation. But also because there is a sense in which capitalism is back then a sort of pretty private, oligarchic kind of enterprise where wealth is highly concentrated and there is a sense of inscrutability about the whole thing. This is obviously a kind of long era of robber barons of the kind of Gilded Age really coming to an end in 1929 and going out with a bang. And
people who still have their names on various things, right? JP Morgan, Carnegie Mellon, and so on. This is the era of those, both robber barons, but also like massive philanthropists, right? They do set up institutions, they do and so on, in a way that, say, Musk, right, does not.
Well, but you could argue that, Schwartzman of Blackstone has been a huge philanthropist, and those guys are the new robber barons, but that's a kind of side point.
The biggest donation to Oxford since the Renaissance.
Exactly.
Put in the book, yeah.
Yes, Oxford Centre of the Humanities, is it? I'm yet to visit, but I have been promised a tour by one of the academics there, so I'm very, very much looking forward to that. So out of that era of an attempt to kind of regulate markets, you get the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which plays a big role in terms of, I think, guiding the types of companies that emerge from this period. So basically what companies have to do is if they want to raise money from the public, they now have to share a certain amount of information with the public. Otherwise, they can't access that money, and instead they're going to have to resort to just raising it from their rich friends. And so that period gives rise to what looked like a completely different a completely different style of company to what previously existed. You get the kind of emergence of large, bureaucratic, vertically integrated firms staffed by expert managers who, I mean, I'm, being very favourable to the managers. I'm sure not all of them were experts, but there is a sense in which you get the kind of separation of private and public power within the corporate realm. And so there's this idea that these firms staffed by these managers are meant to be run in an efficient manner. People are supposed to get their jobs based on merit. And you get this sort of, by the 1950s, thanks in part to the Second World War and the kind of close allegiance between the corporate realm and the government during that period, this is really the kind of age of the managerial corporation. And you get this kind of cultural discussion of these corporations as being, successful, but ultimately deeply boring, places where the managers all go home in their cars to their suburban wives who have Tupperware parties and they enjoy good steak dinners and all of this type of thing. And so it's really tied up with a sort of golden age of American supremacy and American capitalism. But what happens, and it's worth also saying at this point that the concept of the kind of financier and finance does not play such a central role in the American economy. It's been put on a very tight leash. The financier does not really exist as an idea. And I think it's Adolf Bell who says companies, I'm going to misquote him, but it says something along the lines of companies don't really need finance. they raise it themselves because they don't actually have to go. Yeah, and they profit. And they, in an ideal form, they invest the money that they borrow in productive enterprises that are supposed to improve. Well, caveat, they don't always do this, but they're supposed to basically improve the wealth of the nation by investing the money that they borrow in productive activities. But so this is all going along really well. Then what happens is that you get the 1970s, and there are a kind of confluence of factors that come together that suddenly mean that American capitalism in this kind of gilded form is starting to, really struggle. You have the fact that post-war, the European and Japanese factories that have been previously bombed to oblivion have now sort of rebuilt themselves and are starting to actually look like viable competitors to, say, the American car manufacturing industry. You've got the oil crisis. You've got the rise of kind of labor unrest. And you've also got the fact that a lot of these companies that were doing really well in the 1950s have basically gotten so large and have bought up loads of their competitors and have expanded into lines of business that they know basically nothing about. And so there's this real sense of kind of economic contraction and real difficulty within a corporate realm that previously looked to be on an extremely stable footing. And what happens is the shareholder revolution in short. But I think within that, there's a number of interesting things to pick out. So you get...
What is the shareholder revolution?
The sense in which a lot of these companies are governed by these managers who are not beholden to the owners of these companies, i.e. the shareholders. So remember, the companies are publicly listed. Their owners are the people who own shares in them. And the managers are just having such a great time living high on the hog, going on like shooting weekends, dining out, all of the things that like sound really great fun, and they're not actually creating value for the shareholders. And so the shareholder revolution, what gets discussed as that, is basically a means by which the managers are supposed to be made accountable to the shareholders and create that value for them. And that's obviously, well, I say obviously, that is really significant in the history of kind of 20th century capitalism. But
for sure, part
of this is, what emerges from this is this idea, particularly kind of, I guess, what would be the word, propagated by, or at least like envisaged by this guy, Michael Jensen, who is a professor at Rochester, who was previously at the University of Chicago. And he comes across the idea that, or he decides or imagines that basically debt will play a central role in creating that value and in resolving that conflict between managers and shareholders, or what he calls as kind of principals and agents. And so in a series of papers, starting with one called, I can't remember the name of it, but it's more about public companies. And he's initially, it's worth saying, actually a real fan of public companies. He calls them an awesome invention. But then he becomes increasingly disillusioned with them. And in one paper, he writes on this idea called the discipline of debt. And it's basically the idea that if you heap debt upon a company, you can effectively create a rod for the manager's back. So a company that is heaped with debt will have to become much more selective about what it chooses to spend its money on. So its managers will no longer be able to afford to pay themselves such lavish wages, or kind of, if they're not doing well, or fill their offices with like pointless computer equipment, or just hire loads and loads of secretaries that are really attractive or whatever. I mean, they can still hire attractive secretaries, but I think he makes this point about the fact that so many of them have been, judging their power based upon these types of trivial considerations rather than actually creating value for the people who own the companies.
It seems a bit like a kind of capitalist version of David Graeber's bullshit jobs critique.
Yeah, I guess partly. Yeah, in a sense you could say that. But this idea, this discipline of debt, is really the kind of intellectual scaffolding for the emergence of private equity, because what happens is it gets seized upon as a sort of justification for something that is also playing out at this period in time, which is that financial markets are becoming increasingly significant within the kind of within American capitalism, and people within those markets and a kind of renegade group of financiers are starting to take over the conglomerates that have become, ailing, bloated, and have expanded into lines of business that they really shouldn't have expanded into. And so those takeover artists, those people who are practicing the early or doing the early leverage buyouts, really look to this idea of the discipline of debt as a sort of justification for what they're doing. Because the idea essentially is that debt will make companies leaner, meaner, more efficient. And so you get T. Boone Pickens, who is one of the kind of big takeover guys, waving copies of Michael Jensen's article at his opponents. And you get this real sense in which what we're doing by taking over companies and heaping debt upon them will make them much, much better. And, you know, at first, there are some improvements, partly because so many of these companies are not particularly well governed. The longer run improvements are much more difficult to spot. But it's a very different, I mean, it's a different story in Britain. There are some similarities, but we can kind of talk about the British kind of revolution in terms of the class components of finance, if you want, as well.
I'm really interested in that, but I want to get a sort of concrete sense of what happens when a private equity firm buys a company, right? You buy a company, you raise debt, you buy a company using that debt. You then push that debt down onto that company. So it's now the company that is indebted, not you, even though you bought it. And so the company is now indebted. What are you doing to make it more profitable? Are we in this kind of corporate raider paradigm where in a few months you just strip out all the assets, you sell this, you sell this, you sell this? Or is private equity doing something slightly longer term here? Like what are the things you would actually do concretely with a company to increase its value, to demonstrate the superiority of your form of capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, there's the story, there's the kind of myth or the story, and then there's the reality. And the story is to do with, you know, private equity fund or private equity fund manager would argue that they were in a position where they could install better managers, make savings on things that were obviously needed to make savings on. Decide that actually this subsidiary is not doing so well, so let's redesign our corporate structure in a way that creates value more effectively, put in better computers, do things that are basically meant to make a company more productive. The reality is that I think very often the temptation to cut costs is quite high because you're looking for ways to service this debt, and because actually there is sometimes what can seem to a financier as a form of fat might actually seem to a worker a form of, you know, actually a decent paycheck, for example. So there was the Walgreens takeover recently in the US where a private equity fund paid some of the kind of paid holidays that workers were getting. And that's part of the story here, is that there is, you know, workers do not do particularly well out of this. And particularly in that early phase of leverage buyouts, there is this real pushback against these, not just from unions, who are some of obviously the opponents of this, but also from the old guard of finance itself. Because amongst the kind of takeover guys, you have this sort of celebration of this idea of popular revolt and this almost kind of resentment of established power, in the sense that this, I suppose, waspish elite of finance and kind of corporate managers and the state that has dominated American capitalism and society for the last 50 years is now going to get taken down by us. And within that elite, there is a real sense of, we don't like what these guys are up to. And so one of the people who is really critical of this is Felix Rohatyn, who is a really, really, really well-known investment banker at the time, who represents a sort of sage of finance, or elderly sage, who has been, I guess, in a position of established power for a number of years. And he calls us out as being sort of nothing more but greed. And so it's interesting that I think that even people who aren't necessarily your obvious critics of this can see through it quite clearly from the outset.
So you did mention a moment ago the sort of strangeness of the way in which this gets deployed in the UK, where capitalism in the 1970s is perhaps even more sclerotic and sort of slowing down at the end of the social democratic era than it is in America. America is still industrial superpower and so on. Britain is really, really struggling in lots of sort of indices, inflation through the roof and so on. How does private equity get deployed in the 1970s in the UK and sort of set us up with a few perhaps kind of exciting characters for the last 15 years of unremitting disaster?
I mean, it doesn't get started in the UK until a little bit after the 1970s, but the 1970s also are a crucial time in Britain for understanding where this comes from. And I think partly also the fact that Britain has lost its empire by this point, and that's really significant. And the City of London, we take it for granted today that it is this gigantic, it's a European financial centre. Actually, after the war in particular, it looks completely different. So London banks have completely lost their supremacy to, I think Zurich becomes a much bigger actor in the 1950s and 60s until the Big Bang. And the London Stock Exchange had basically became this kind of very nationally focused, almost kind of village green feel of a place where you have the sense in which people are everyone knows everyone. They're dealing with companies that that have no kind of international presence other than the fact that some of them are still dealing to export markets. And there's this brilliant quote I came across from a journalist who I think it was in David Kinniston's book on the city, which is fantastic, who'd kind of gone in search of these young meteors of thrusting meritocratic New Britain. And he interviews this old Etonian turned stockbroker in his family's firm who says, "Do I work hard? Well, frankly, no. I get down to the office after the rush hour, about 10:15, and I leave just before it, about 4 o'clock. Some keen chaps arrive before it and leave after it, but it doesn't really do them much good." And it's this sense in which things are just very cushy, and basically the city is a place where family relationships still dominates, and where I think it was only a third of people in Britain that had a bank account by the late 1950s, only a third of working people in Britain. So actually finance, again, was in this almost kind of vestigial role, or playing this vestigial role. And that is something that it's sort of trundling along really until the Big Bang. And then when you get the Big Bang in 1986, you get this sense in which the city becomes much more international. But also, in a sense, you get this sort of emergence of the idea that I guess there is this populism to markets. The idea that markets are sort of, they're no longer dictated by these toffs, but actually sort of represent this sense in which they're a logic unto themselves. And so and I think that becomes, interesting when we think about the sort of some of the political shifts we've seen since then. But in terms of the private equity story, there are a few people I was really interested in when I was writing and researching the book. And one was James Goldsmith, who, as some of you, as you probably already knew him as the father of Zach Goldsmith, who was obviously involved with the Greens. And James Goldsmith was this really fascinating kind of aristocratic or kind of minor nobility figure within Britain. He both belonged to the upper classes and yet had never really sort of felt at home within them. And he becomes actually somebody who ends up doing leverage buyouts in the US later on. And his kind of business techniques or business methods or whatever you want to call them have a lot to do with the heaping of debt upon companies that we've talked about. And he also ends up mingling with a lot of these takeover guys in the US after he moves there in the 1980s. But his critique of British capitalism is one that I think really resonates then with people who actually become much more pivotal to the emergence of private equity in Britain. So he basically feels that actually the kind of declining character of British capitalism can be blamed upon these cultural factors that have to do with the fact that this emerging middle class has ended up sort of aping the practices of the British aristocracy in a way that actually these aristocratic kind of values are to blame for really holding back British capitalism in the sense that they're really effete. They're sort of, I guess one of the kind of classic examples would be like Isambard Kingdom Brunel sending his sons to Harrow, where they go and then study greats or classics, whatever, rather than actually teaching them how to be great engineers. I don't know if that actually happened, but that's the kind of like caricature version of this argument.
We will
and it's
fact check it.
Yeah. And it's this sense that, British economic decline can be blamed on British culture, because British culture is aristocratic and it's this sort of private members club, which is actually kind of a different thing to what is going on in the US in many ways. And so I think that he basically takes one look at Britain after doing business there for a number of years, and he says, actually, I'm going to move to the US and I'm going to start doing leverage buyouts there. But I think that with Goldsmith, you get this sense, I suppose, that he is a kind of sort of Trumpian before Trump really exists in much of his politics. But also he speaks to the way in which finance is sort of reconstituting itself as a class during this period, where what happens is you get the kind of, I suppose, partially after the Big Bang, but also more generally since then, you've had the emergence of kind of what gets called second wave finance. So kind of forms of private capital becoming much, much, much more dominant within our economy. And those look very, very different to what preceded them. The kind of, again, there's this class element of, you know, the investment banks, the sort of clubby elite being dominated by a particular type of person who maybe isn't actually very good at doing their job because they've been comfortable for too long. And in Goldsmith, you do also get this sense of kind of glorifying in this sort of revolutionary spirit of basically kicking the elite. It's just that Goldsmith belongs to that elite. And it's, I think when you start mapping those dynamics within Britain particularly, you see how there are these really interesting affinities between some of those kind of second wave financial actors, or whatever you want to call them, people who are invested in things like private markets, hedge funds, private equity, who are doing that type of thing, and the right. And one of the books I really enjoyed on this, or the research I really found useful on this, was by Theo Bourgeron and Marlon Banquet. I'm going to totally mispronounce their names. I'm sorry for doing that. And they looked at I'm going to look up the statistics. They looked at the donations that had been made to the different parts of the campaign, the EU referendum campaign, by the finance sector. And so what they found was that there was this.
It's not
sort
just
of,
in the 90s, right? This
is prior to the 2016 referendum. So essentially, what I'm talking about is the way in which the kind of class politics of finance has reconstituted itself, and I think that helps to provide an explanation, or at least part of the explanation, for what we now see as some of the kind of political frictions we're seeing in Britain. And what they found is that there is this really interesting pattern when you look at the donations to the Remain, Leave campaigns prior to the referendum. So over half of the money donated to Leave came from the financial sector, whereas only 36% of the money donated to Remain came from finance, which fair enough is kind of maybe what you'd expect. But when you drill into the actual numbers from the kind of realm of second wave finance, or alternative assets, or private finance, whatever you want to call it, 90%,
in which private equity is one part,
in which private equity is one actor amongst some others, 90% of the money given by hedge fund managers went to Leave, and 70% of the money from private equity fund managers went to Leave. And so there's a sort of disproportionate representation of that type of finance going towards Leave and leaving the EU. And I think Goldsmith, the reason I found him so interesting was because he was a sort of precursor to that Euroscepticism that has now become such a defining feature of the British political landscape. He obviously founded the EU referendum, or the referendum party, which was, I think, the first referendum party in Britain, long before Nigel Farage. And he wrote really extensively about what he came to see as a kind of bureaucratic overreach of the EU. And for him, this became the sort of number one target during his later years. Previously, he directed his kind of attention more towards the kind of corporate bureaucrats that he really despised. And then it became really the EU technocrats that he despised. And I think there's a kind of interesting affinity also between obviously somebody like Nigel Farage and private capital. Less obvious to me, though, is the way in which somebody like Goldsmith, you see that there is a sense in which he belongs to the British elite, and so he can kind of criticize its cultural aspects and blame those for what he sees as British economic decline. Whereas Farage, I think, sort of almost wants to become part of the British elite. He's a slightly different figure in that way. But he obviously shares, that deep Euroscepticism. And I think, again, you could say considers himself something of an insurgent and a sort of renegade, as pitched in opposition to what he sees as a kind of establishment class of finance.
He's also does some extremely eccentric things, which I think marry him to Farage later as well. He mails 5 million VHS tapes to UK homes during the 97 general elections. That's when Blair gets into power. Presumably I don't know what they had on them, but presumably they had like a kind of a pro-EU referendum, like kind of video. Don't know. He also funds a song called "Let the People Decide." People should go and listen to it on Spotify. Currently has the artist in question, which is Maxime Hargreaves. Never heard of him, her, don't know. Them has one monthly listener, and that monthly listener is me.
Well, maybe we can make it a couple more after this recording. Yeah. Let's give them more. Let's give them some more lessons.
I want to come back to this page and at least be 10. So please go and listen to Let the People Decide, original 1997 version, and absolute banger. But on a sort of serious note, there is this question about the different interests, the different parts of finance. Of course, they have different things they want from markets. They have different interest rates. They have different sort of arrangements of bureaucracy and so on. But also there's this factor you mentioned before, which is that Goldsmiths really sees himself as a kind of non-elite elite, right? Someone who is sort of outside of the proper British elites, certainly outside of the parts of it he finds sclerotic and slow and boring and unambitious. How do you see that? I mean, in your sort of overall assessment of the rise of the radical or populist right over the last sort of few decades, do you see that idea of the people themselves feeling themselves to be members of a counter elite as essential, or do you favor a more sort of structural, I guess, explanation of this kind of thing? When you met these people, what did it seem to you that this is a quirk of personality, or it's a feature of a structural position inside capitalism that means they want certain things?
Interesting. I mean, I think there's a few things going on there. The first thing I'd say is that nobody wants to be the bad guy. So whenever you're interviewing someone, you'll never get the kind of sense in which, you never get a completely accurate representation of where they sit within an elite, because nobody really wants to consider themselves necessarily part of an elite, particularly when they're talking to, a journalist who has kind of critical views on their industry. But I think that, take somebody like Farage, who I think is really interesting in this way, because he is sort of both of the elite and not. I mean, he went to Dulwich College. His father was, I think, a stockbroker. And there's this, what I find interesting about him is that he seems to sort of be cosplaying elements of that elite, because he doesn't fully belong to it in the way that somebody like Goldsmith did. He works as a commodities trader at the London Metal Exchange, which is one of the only, the only trading floor which still has a kind of open outcry trading. And there's a kind of interesting vein of Euroscepticism that arises from that context, because there is a sense in which this really antiquated practice is being protected from the kind of overreach of European bureaucity. But also
open outcry trading is literally when you're yelling, sell, buy, sell, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's a kind of, and you can watch videos of it online, and it's a sense of what trading used to be about. A guy standing up with a phone on each of his ears, and sort of gesticulating wildly across a room. And I think actually there is this. Eventually, the LME, the London Metals Exchange, will definitely have to comply with the sort of shift towards electronic trading. But there was a sense of digging its heels in and actually saying, no, we want to protect this antiquated practice. But when he was working there, he was also doing things like he was part of a group of people who met every Monday, I think, once a month, to discuss kind of Eurosceptic politics and eat loads of British food and drink loads of beer. And was it the Jamaica Wine House or one of these kind of taverns? And then, lots of long lunches at Sweetings, wearing pinstripes, and this sense of kind of belonging to this gentlemanly club. And I think that, and so he wants to kind of both belong to that, but also I think sees that some of its kind of hidebound aspects are, troubling to him, or at least he wants to. And perhaps it's that within finance itself is a sort of a place where there are more people, certainly, who share his Eurosceptic beliefs, some of his kind of more further to the right beliefs, and are pitching themselves against, some of the what they see as a sort of established kind of investment banker types who are not traders, who are not those kind of fast talking, decisive, I guess extremely kind of sometimes, at least in the 80s, drinking an awful lot of alcohol, those types of people. And I think there is a sense in which, there is a sort of an enjoyment of pushing back against some of that. So I think there are really interesting class aspects to those different parts of finance. But more broadly, I think that there are, I suppose, when I think about what explanatory power something like private capital has for understanding the rights, it feels as though actually really it is more structural. Because when you look at what a private equity owned firm looks like compared to your kind of classical bureaucratic firm of the 20th century, this is a type of ownership where the power and decision making is concentrated, where there is a sense of it not being accountable to the public or having to engage with the public in the way that a publicly listed firm would have to. And actually a sense of sort of extending from that, patrimonial power, where there is individual, and they mostly men, making extremely significant decisions about the future of a firm, about the people who work for that firm, kind of discussing these amongst themselves in closed rooms and not really being beholden to either the other stakeholders in that firm or society at large. And so I think the explanatory power of this as a style of ownership has much more to do, for me at least, with looking at it as a kind of at what that type of ownership entails at the corporate level, rather than just thinking about individuals who pitch themselves as sort of outside of or belonging to or wanting to take down an elite. Having said that, definitely one of the themes that I kept encountering with the people I interviewed was, and Guy Hans was really interesting on this, he told me, that I quote him in the book as saying something along the lines of, investment bankers were sort of the old guard. They were fuddy-duddy. They were sort of part of the establishment. And he's a private equity fund manager who founded Terra Firma. He's also quite famous in Britain for being a kind of big private equity guy. He became really involved with Thatcherite politics during his time at university. And for him, it seemed as though actually there was this crossover between that Thatcherite project of sort of breathing life into the blue-blooded establishment and this revolution against the kind of British elite, and also how he viewed finance at that time. And I don't think he even particularly wanted to go into finance, or at least that's what he said to me, because actually it was seen as sort of a bit of a backwater in the late 70s compared to what he wanted to be, which is a sort of entrepreneur. And it's interesting that the word entrepreneur is, again, something that comes up a lot and actually wasn't really something that got used as much prior to the 1980s. So I think all of these things are tied together. But for me, the looking at just the level of at the level of corporate ownership and at that kind of structural level is perhaps has more explanatory power.
I believe it was George Bush W who said that the problem with the French is they don't have a word for entrepreneur.
I love that. Yeah,
such a great line.
I love it. I love it.
Obviously, Trump has his own amazing lines, but W, if only he hadn't gone to war in Iraq or done any of his other policies, actually. But if only he hadn't done that, we might remember him very differently. We probably wouldn't. I want to come to the contradiction.
Yeah,
I want to come to the contradiction in your subtitle, right? Talk about Hettie O'Brien, the asset class. How private equity turned capitalism against itself. In what way did private equity turn capitalism against itself? Profits are still pretty high. People are still, at least the owners of, the underlying assets. The owners of the stock of the private equity firm. People who are investing in them doing pretty well. Why is this not, in fact, capitalism thriving? Why is it capitalism turned against itself?
There's a few levels at which to read that. The first is very simple, that there is this irony that something that is created by its early proponents, the people who imagined it, as this kind of solution to some of the problems that they diagnosed with that later stage of 20th century capitalism. So they basically thought that they had discovered, the people who invented private equity or really got behind it, felt as though they had discovered this ingenious tool for breathing life into tired corporations. That's obviously a very good faith reading of what they were up to. And the irony now is that it's being blamed for not only the destruction of various social institutions that capitalism relies upon to reproduce itself, so care, water, housing, all of these types of things, but also that one of its big in innovations, private credit, is now regulators are discussing this as though it's the kind of next ticking time bomb that is going to help to, if not cause, then at least exacerbate the effects of the next financial crisis. So you can say, well, that's just, isn't capitalism always doing this kind of thing? It's always prone to these kind of explosive contradictions and eventually crises. And that's true. But I still think that there was an irony looming over the book that it was invented in a particular time period as doing one thing. It's now really, I would argue, helping to undermine that principle. And I think that on another level, when you think about private equity as a model, really speculative, sort of debt-driven speculation, which is partially what it's about, is sort of become a lot of where it's the principal model for wealth creation within our economy. Because when you think about, that 20th century idea of capitalism in its ideal form, the idea was that the pie would get bigger every year. People would all get a share of that pie. Our shares would be different sizes, sure. So that you might get way more than I would. But the fact that I might get more next year would mean that I would be able to tolerate some level of inequality. And now what's happening is that not only is that pie not growing in the same way, particularly in Britain, but some people are getting loads and other people are getting absolutely none. And I think that PE plays a role in that, because when you look at the type of business, the type of activity that it is, it's not really investing in productive activity that necessarily helps to grow the pie. It's investing in it as a form of activity. It's basically siphoning wealth upwards and using debt to do so. Yep. And I think that kind of debt-driven speculation, I was interested in the way that also plays out, in the furthest reaches of the internet, or not even the furthest reaches, but, parts of the internet where you see people, influencers, saying that the way to make money in this economy is to buy loads of properties using loads of mortgages, turn them into HMOs, rent them out to some, in some thankless way to some poor renter, and hey presto, you found yourself a really nice way of generating passive income. And so that to me doesn't have that much, that it actually looks quite similar to private equity when you think of actually the basic mechanics of what it is doing. But I think that I suppose when I was thinking about this at the kind of theoretical level, I was thinking a lot about Ferdinand Braudel, who has this kind of analogy of the house to explain where capitalism has come to, and its sort of evolution over the last 2 centuries, or 3 centuries even. And on the bottom floor of the house, you have material life, which is a kind of basic sort of people doing stuff. And then you get the emergence of markets, whereas sort of this idea that markets are competitive and transparent and everybody can sort of play a role in them if they have something to buy or to sell. And then on the top story of the house, you get capitalism, or the capitalist realm. And it's a sense in which some of the people on the second story, the sort of market story, discovered that they could actually do far better for themselves by getting rid of those elements of transparency and competition. And doing things, I think he writes that mere mortals will find pretty horrifying, paraphrasing him. And I think that sense of that kind of evolution of capitalism into something that is so far distanced from the way in which we think of it in its ideal form is really what private equity has come to be. I think that's part of the reason for the subtitle, and sort of what I was grappling with when I was writing it was sort of, I think it helps explain a lot of what we see in terms of where capitalism has come to now and what is driving wealth creation and wealth accumulation in our economy, and who the winners and the losers of that really are.
All is not well, however, in the realm of private equity. Right? We've sort of painted a picture of this rapacious, semi-demonic beasts roaming the markets, eating companies and destroying them, selling off assets, wage repression, and so on. All the kind of the classic things. We've almost painted them as unassailable, and that is not the case. There is, in some ways, a kind of a crisis brewing, perhaps, in the private equity, which might then cascade, as you mentioned earlier, into a crisis for capitalism more widely. One of the markers of that is that some private equity firms are trying to open up investment in their funds to people who are not the elite. And this is in some ways like an undermining of the idea of private equity. it is supposed to be for the elite, right? It's supposed to be for millionaires, billionaires, or sometimes people sort of, are like everyday normal people, but invested through pensions and so on. Why is this a worrying sign for the industry as a whole that private equity is trying to capture people who don't make £1 million a year?
I mean, if you look at the history of this industry, its calling card was always that it only worked with the world's most sophisticated investors. People who were supposed to know have so much money that they were supposed to know exactly what was sensible to do with that money. So they didn't need the same regulatory protections as you or I, but also sophisticated in the sense of they were smart, and so they put their money into private equity. And that was part of its attraction or its allure. And so when you see it opening up to retail investors, I think it speaks to a kind of Ponzi scheme dynamic where rather than actually creating the value that it's ostensibly supposed to be creating for its investors, it is instead looking for new inflows of capital to keep the whole machine going. I also think that it's really interesting in the US particularly, where you have private equity lobbying very aggressively to get access to 401k accounts, which are your just standard retirement account offering. And they've now got that access thanks to the second Trump administration. And that is partially ties into that kind of Ponzi scheme dynamic where something is really struggling to create the value that it said it was going to create. So over the last however many years it is, private equity funds have taken in $1.5 trillion more from their investors than they have actually generated in returns. And so that value point is sort of failing on its own terms. And so what do you do when that's the case? Well, not only do you look for new inflows of capital, but you also lobby politically for those. So actually your ability to create value as an industry has less to do with actual value creation, however defined, and more to do with your proximity to the political class. Cynically, you could also argue that lobbying for 401k access is almost a way of deepening your hold on society such that when the thing does explode, if it does explode, you're more likely to get a bailout when you have that kind of gigantic effect on not just some pension funds, but everybody's pensions. But I think that to me, it's also about what value creation looks like nowadays and the extent to which there is this real irrationality to markets in general. Actually, a lot of the things that we see as like take the SpaceX listing, for example. This is a company that has never created a profit. It's a company that its internal kind of corporate structure really is quite eyebrow raising. It's a company that its calling card is putting humans on Mars and building a kind of Martian-like colony, which just by all accounts is an insane thing to be doing and something that you would look at typically and be like, obviously I'm not going to invest in that. And yet, because of the proximity to government and to the political class, and in the case of SpaceX, the ability to be so gigantic and so politically connected that the SEC changed its, or indexing rules were changed prior to the IPO, such that SpaceX got access to indexes much more quickly than your average company would be able to do so. To me, that is emblematic of how value now looks to be judged in an entirely different way, in a way that is much more political and much less about price discovery or about markets working in the kind of ideal way that markets are taught to economics undergraduates.
I think it's a vindication very much of that idea from Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff that they talked about in the episode on Muskism they recently did called Financial Fabulism, in which the operations of financial markets just sort of don't massively in any clear way correspond to the actual possibilities of that company, but run in much more surreal, kind of financial surrealism in some ways is a way of thinking about that.
Yeah, and I think somewhat naively, I started by thinking there are all these morbid symptoms surrounding private equity. There is the fact that they're resorting to these Byzantine agreements involving huge amounts of debt rather than actually being able to generate the returns for their investors that they have promised. They are simply taking on more debt in order to release cash to those investors. They are now opening it up to non-sophisticated investors. All of these things that feel like real alarm bells flashing up. And I thought, well, obviously, that means the wheels are going to fall off soon, right? I was totally wrong because I think actually that's kind of based on quite a quaint idea of how markets can hold. That markets are sort of almost a form of accountability, of a form of kind of price discovery, of a form of testing value. And actually markets don't do that. And it's much, there's that Keynesian quote, perhaps apocryphal Keynes quote, where it's like markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. But I think really what this is about is the fact that value, is connected to politics more so than it is connected to actually anything that we would think of as being a kind of reality or an arbiter of reality. I find that really quite sinister, actually.
There's a kind of classic, very simplistic Marxist idea. I'm going to state it simplistically, right? Based in superstructure, which is that there is sort of economic base and economic production process. And then there's politics, and it's sort of, as the questions I was asking earlier is James Goldsmith's and Nigel Farage's, is there EU skepticism downstream of their economic position, right? It's a kind of a version of this argument, right? Is it all ultimately determined by economics in the end? And I think you're absolutely right to say that there has been some sort of very peculiar change in that relationship, where it seems like political proximity and involvement in like an old boys network, right? In that kind of like pre-1929 style of capitalism that we were talking about at the very beginning, that kind of pre-Wall Street crash, right? That involvement in that network, who your dad is, right? Like seems to matter now for global capitalism much more, especially when we're talking about things like the Qatari sovereign wealth funds, right? Where it's very obviously about who your dad is. It seems to matter much more than the kind of the rational forces of price discovery and discipline by the market, which seems in some ways to have undermined exactly what the purpose of private equity was in the original, right? The original purpose was to discipline capital, to make it more rational, to do price discovery, to allow for the complacent management class to be swept aside. And now we just have a new complacent, non-management, but sort of financier class.
Well, I think about that a lot, actually, all the time. The kind of, is it economic? Is it cultural? And I always think it's kind of both a mixture of the two. And I think actually when you're looking at this, yes, private capital does provide some kind of materialist guide to some of the political shifts that we're now seeing. But also some of those political shifts are about people who really share this kind of they share this kind of hatred of the idea of bureaucratic overreach, of the administrative state, of also, coupled to the administrative state, the bureaucratic corporation, because both of those involve, I think it's what Melinda Cooper calls the kind of impersonal mediation of power, and the idea that power is private power and public power, sort of separate domains, and you don't have a kind of blurring of the two. And that's really the kind of, the premise both of the kind of 20th century corporation, but also of the idea of state power that you and I have grown up with. And so to me, it's sort of also when you're mapping this on politically more broadly, you can see how something like this style of ownership is partly a way of taking the economy back to that pre-1929 moment where it was private, it was oligarchic, it was unaccountable. But also more generally, we're seeing how we're seeing the kind of return of sort of pre-modern forms of rule, this kind of rule by men, this rule by quote unquote autocrats, the sense in which you can blend private office or public office with private power so with such ease. And I think that it is everything tied up at once. It is the economic, it is the cultural. And I think that's why, to me, it speaks to those bigger political shifts where you get the sense in which this style of corporate ownership is not just about, wealth, siphoning wealth upwards. It's also about a style of doing business and doing politics where private decision-making has a much greater role. But I think you have to ask politically where that's taking us. And it really worries me that a lot of the things that we have taken for granted, and I say we as in, the public at large within Western democracies have taken for granted about what power looks like, not just at the corporate level, but at the political level, are now being turned on their head. And this is part of it, I think.
Hettie O'Brien, thank you for doing your own research.
Thank you.